There is a kind of love that never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with roses or declarations or the nervous trembling of a man down on one knee. It arrives quietly, the way frost arrives on a window pane. You don't see it happening. You only notice it when the morning light catches the glass and you think, how long has that been there? Marisol Vega knew Daniel Harrow for 17 years before she understood him. 17 years of thinking she knew exactly what he was, the boy who watched her get her heart broken by his cousin, the man who disappeared when things got complicated, the stranger who reappeared at her mother's funeral with grief in his eyes that she didn't know how to read. She thought she had him figured out. She thought the proposal, when it came, was cruelty wrapped in a diamond ring. She thought he was paying her back for every slight, real or imagined, that had collected between them like stones in a jar. She was wrong. But here's the thing about being wrong in matters of the heart. It doesn't feel like being corrected. It feels like the ground opening beneath your feet. It feels like the moment before you realize you're falling isn't terror at all. It's relief. This is the story of two people who loved each other in the wrong direction for too long. A rancher's daughter from the high desert of New Mexico. A half-Apache cowboy who kept his emotions the way his grandfather kept arrowheads, carefully, privately, in a place nobody else was allowed to look. And me. I'm just the man who was there for most of it, the one who kept the logbook, the one who watched it unfold across 17 years of red dirt and broken fences and moments so human they made my chest ache. I'll try to write it down the way it actually happened. No shortcuts, no tidy endings. Just the truth of two people who almost missed each other completely. I've kept one since I was 19 years old and hired on at the Vega Ranch outside of Cimarron, New Mexico, a small spiral-bound notebook, one per season, stacked in a trunk at the foot of my bed. My mother thought it was a prayer journal. My foreman, old Hector, thought it was a gambling ledger. It was neither. It was just the habit of a man who noticed too much and had nowhere to put it. What I wrote down wasn't always important. Weather patterns, the particular way a horse favored its left foreleg on cold mornings, which fence posts were rotting, the date the acequia ran dry, small things, the architecture of ordinary days. But I also wrote down the things I shouldn't have, arguments I witnessed, silences that lasted too long. The way Marisol Vega laughed differently at 18 than she had at 14, not less exactly, but more carefully, like she'd learned that laughter could be used against you. I wrote down the first time I saw Daniel Harrow look at her. It was a Tuesday in late October. I know because I dated every entry. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the air had that particular bite that comes to the high desert before the first real snow, dry and clean and almost sweet, like something burning far away. Marisol was in the corral, working a young quarter horse named Segundo. She was 17. Daniel was 18, visiting his aunt who lived on the neighboring property, and he'd come over to return a borrowed saddle blanket. He stopped at the corral fence. He didn't say anything. He just watched her work the horse, patient, deliberate, reading the animal's weight shifts the way a person reads a sentence. Marisol hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on Segundo, on the way his ears swiveled when she spoke low to him, on the small negotiations between her body and his. Daniel watched for almost 4 minutes. I know because I was timing how long it took Segundo to accept the saddle, and I was looking in roughly the same direction, and I noticed the boy at the fence. What I noticed about him was this: he wasn't watching the horse. He had the look of someone trying to memorize something. Not the greedy, obvious staring of a teenage boy noticing a girl. It was quieter than that, more careful, like he was trying to understand something and suspected he might not get another chance to look. I wrote it down that night. Daniel Harrow at the fence today, something in his face I can't name. I couldn't name it then. I was 23 and not particularly wise about such things. It would take me years to identify what I'd seen. By the time I understood it, everything had already gone sideways between them, and understanding it felt less like an insight and more like a diagnosis delivered too late. The Vega family had ranched that land for 4 generations. Marisol's great-grandmother had come from Chihuahua with $30 and a mule, and had somehow, through stubbornness or luck or both, held onto the same parcel of high desert through drought and depression, and a cattle market that never quite cooperated. Her granddaughter Alina, Marisol's mother, ran the operation with a kind of quiet competence that made outsiders underestimate her and employees trust her completely. I was one of the latter. Elena Vega hired me fresh out of a rough patch I don't need to describe here, asked me 3 practical questions about horses and fence repair, and told me I could start Monday. She never asked where I'd been or why I'd left the last place. She just handed me a cup of coffee and pointed at the bunkhouse. I stayed 9 years that first stretch. Marisol was 11 when I arrived. I watched her grow up the way you watch a season change, gradual, and then suddenly complete. She was serious-natured, curious, capable of a particular kind of fierce focus when something interested her. She could also be impulsive in ways that cost her, not reckless exactly, but prone to conviction. When she believed something, she believed it completely, and the strength that was her best quality was also the thing that got her into trouble. She believed from the beginning that she understood people. She was right about most of them. She was catastrophically wrong about Daniel Harrow. His history is important, so let me lay it out plainly. Daniel was the son of an Anglo father and an Apache mother, specifically Jicarilla Apache, from the northern New Mexico bands whose territory had once covered the land that various ranchers, including the Vegas, now occupied. His mother, Luisa, had died when he was 8. His father had struggled, and then given up on struggling, and sent Daniel to live with his aunt, Margaret, who had married into a ranching family that bordered the Vega property. Margaret was good people. She was also overwhelmed and not especially equipped to raise a grieving half-Apache boy who didn't talk much and scared the other children at school with his stillness. She did her best. Her best was imperfect and insufficient, but it was genuine, which counted for something. Daniel spent his summers in Cimarron and his school years in Albuquerque, where his father maintained a thin fiction of involvement in his life. He learned 2 versions of himself, the one that moved through Anglo spaces, quiet and careful and watchful, and the one that relaxed slightly in the summers near the land his mother had grown up adjacent to. The second version of himself, I noticed, only really appeared around Marisol. Not because she did anything in particular, not because she was kind in any pointed or significant way, but because Marisol had the gift, which she didn't recognize as a gift, of treating people the same way she treated the horses, without agenda, without theater, just a patient attention to what they actually were rather than what she expected them to be. She treated Daniel like he was simply himself. She didn't soften her observations or choose careful words or study him the way people study something foreign. She just talked to him, argued with him, ignored him when she was busy and recruited him when she needed an extra pair of hands. To Daniel, who had spent most of his life being either invisible or conspicuous in all the wrong ways, this was, I think, the most significant thing anyone had ever done for him. And he never told her. The first rupture came when Marisol was 22. She had been studying at the University of New Mexico, agricultural science, practical and unsentimental, exactly what you'd expect. When she came home for summer and found herself spending more time with Daniel, who was working a summer job in Cimarron before finishing his own degree. I was there for that summer. I'd come back after 2 years working a property in Colorado, rehired by Elena with the same lack of ceremony with which I'd been hired the first time. I had my logbook. I had my routines. What I had not anticipated was watching 2 people fall toward each other at the same angle for 2 months and never quite collide. They rode together, argued about land management and water rights and the particular stubbornness of the acequia system. They sat on Elena's porch in the evenings with bottles of beer and talked until the stars appeared and then kept talking. Daniel's stillness became, around Marisol, something else, not quite relaxed, but occupied, like a man trying to concentrate on one thing when another thing kept pulling at the edge of his attention. And Marisol, here's what I wrote down because it still seems right to me. Even now, Marisol didn't know what she felt. But she knew she felt it loudly. I could see it in the way she moved around him, slightly too carefully, the way you move around something you're afraid of knocking over. Then August arrived, and with it Patrick Harrow, Daniel's cousin, also Margaret's nephew, visiting for 2 weeks from Santa Fe. Patrick Harrow was, objectively speaking, everything Daniel was not: loud where Daniel was quiet, easy where Daniel was careful, immediately charming in a way that required nothing of the person he was charming. Marisol was 22, and had the particular vulnerability of someone who had been careful for too long. Patrick was at the ranch for 6 days before he asked her to dinner. She said yes. I watched Daniel's face when he heard about it. He was by the water trough, refilling the bucket, and Margaret mentioned it with the cheerful thoughtlessness of someone who didn't know better. She said, "Oh, Patrick took your friend Marisol out last night, isn't that something?" Daniel's expression didn't change, not one visible degree. But his hand on the bucket handle went white at the knuckles for a moment, and then he let go, and he walked away without answering his aunt, and I wrote that down too, and I knew what I was looking at, and I felt sick about it. Patrick left at the end of August. He left specifically with Marisol's heart, or at least with the part of it she'd been willing to extend, which was significant if not complete. He left with promises of calls and visits, and this doesn't have to end just because summer does. And then he drove his truck north toward Santa Fe, and within 3 weeks was visibly dating someone else. I know because Marisol found out. Alina told me quietly, in the way she told me things she didn't want to carry alone. Marisol had driven to Santa Fe to surprise Patrick, having saved the trip for a weekend when she'd finished a major project, and had arrived at a restaurant to find him at a corner table with a woman who was clearly not a friend. She drove back 4 hours, alone in the dark. I don't know exactly what happened on that drive. She never talked about it directly. What I know is that when she arrived home at 2 in the morning, she went straight to the barn, and she stayed there for an hour with the horses. And when she came inside, her eyes were dry in the way that eyes are dry after a person has decided they're done crying and means it. Daniel had left for Albuquerque by then, his summer job finished, his window closed. But before he'd left, and this I didn't know until much later, he had done something. He had gone to see Patrick. He had driven to Santa Fe a week before Marisol's disastrous trip, because he had somehow known, through whatever network of cousins and quiet attention, that Patrick was already drifting. He had not gone to make a scene or deliver threats. That wasn't Daniel's way and never had been. He had gone, apparently, to say a few simple things. To say, she is not somebody's summer, she's a person. She deserves to know what she's getting into. Patrick had laughed at him. Not cruelly, I think. Patrick wasn't cruel, just careless, which is its own kind of damage. He'd laughed the way people laugh at things that make them slightly uncomfortable, and he'd said something about Daniel always being too serious, and Daniel had left. He hadn't told Marisol he'd gone. He hadn't told anyone, as far as I could determine. I only found out years later from Margaret, who heard it from Patrick's own admission during a family gathering where Patrick had apparently developed enough retrospective guilt to mention it. So Marisol didn't know. She knew only that Daniel had been there that summer and then had left, the way people left. She categorized him accordingly: a good presence, a temporary one, someone whose significance she'd perhaps overestimated in the warmth of those August evenings. She didn't think about him much for the next 3 years. I thought about him more than I admitted, even in the logbook. What I thought about, specifically, was the question of what a person does with a love they can't use. I was not experienced in love. I had been close to it twice, and had managed, on both occasions, to prioritize my own fear of it over its actual existence. So I was perhaps not qualified to analyze Daniel Harrow's situation. But I watched people for a living, in the way that certain kinds of quiet people watch people. Not coldly, not clinically, but because the human face in the midst of real emotion is one of the most complicated and beautiful things in the world, and you can't look away from complicated, beautiful things. What I came to understand about Daniel over the years was this. He was not pining. He was not diminished by what he felt. He went back to Albuquerque and finished his degree and got work in land management, and eventually came back to northern New Mexico to work with a conservation group focused on a sequoia restoration, a project that, coincidentally or not, brought him periodically into contact with the Vega property. He was building a life, a real one, not as a holding pattern. But he carried it, the way you carry a stone in your pocket that you picked up for no reason except that it fit in your hand and you kept forgetting to put it down. He carried this thing about Marisol the way some people carry a habit, not conspicuously, not debilitatingly, just persistently present in the texture of his days. I know this because of what happened when he came back. It was October again. The high desert has a way of bookmarking things in October, when the light changes and the cottonwoods go gold and the air carries that faint smoke-sweet smell. Marisol was 25. I was back on the Vega ranch for what would turn out to be the last stretch, helping Alina through a difficult year when a water dispute with a neighboring property had tangled up the ranch's finances and operating rhythm. Daniel arrived with a survey team, 4 of us, part of a larger acequia assessment project. He shook hands with Alina and then turned and saw Marisol, who had been expecting the survey team but apparently not expecting Daniel to be part of it. She went very still for a moment. Then she smiled. A real smile, not a polite one. I'd been watching Marisol's smiles for years and I knew the difference. It was the smile she didn't plan. "Daniel," she said, "I didn't know you were on this project." "I didn't know you were still here," he said. Then, catching himself, "I mean, I knew the project involved your property. I didn't know you were back. I thought you might be." "I'm back," she said simply. "Come in, my mother will want to see you." And that was it. 3 years and that was the greeting. Just, "I'm back. Come in." And Daniel nodded and came in, and I watched his face as he followed her across the yard, and I saw what I'd seen the first time at the fence, when he was 18 and she was 17 and he was trying to memorize something. That same look, still there, still careful. I wrote that night, he still has it. Whatever it is, he never put it down. The acequia project took 6 weeks. Daniel stayed in Cimarron for most of it, camping out at Margaret's place, driving the survey routes each morning. In those 6 weeks, he and Marisol rebuilt something. Not what they'd had that August. This was different. Older. Less breathless, more particular. They argued about water allocation the way people who respect each other argue, hard and without drama, giving ground when they were wrong and holding it when they were right. They ate dinner at the Vega table 3 or 4 times a week. Alina, who was not a demonstrative woman, clearly liked having him there. I watched Marisol carefully. I watched her learn him again, the adult version, the man who'd gone away and come back different and the same. I watched her let herself enjoy his company without apparently asking what it meant, which was either wisdom or avoidance and possibly both. I watched Daniel watch her with that same careful attention, that same discipline. He never said anything, not one word that crossed the line from friendship into something that could be mistaken for more. He was, I can only describe it as impeccably restrained, not cold, not distant, present and warm and exactly as friendly as the situation called for and not 1 degree beyond. It frustrated me, which was irrational since it was none of my business. I wrote in the logbook, why doesn't he just say it? What is he waiting for? I didn't understand then what I came to understand later. Daniel Harrow was waiting for something he couldn't quite name, not the right moment, not the right words, but something in himself, some internal condition that needed to be met before he could speak. He was a man who took his own inventory seriously, who didn't act on emotion without first understanding it completely, and what he felt for Marisol was large enough and complicated enough that understanding it completely had taken him, so far, 7 years. He was almost there, and then he left again. The project ended. The survey team dispersed. Daniel said goodbye to Alina, shook hands with me, and stood in the yard with Marisol for about 10 minutes while I pretended to check the fence line nearby and absolutely was not listening. What I heard was ordinary, nothing, the kind of nothing that is actually something. "Come back sometime," Marisol said, "not just for work." "I will," he said. And then he got in his truck and drove away, and Marisol stood in the yard until the sound of the engine was gone, and then she went back inside and I wrote down. She let him leave. He let himself leave. Neither of them did anything. Why does watching 2 people not do a thing feel like watching a disaster happen in slow motion? The disaster, when it came, had nothing to do with them directly. It came in the form of Alina's illness, which appeared first as tiredness, then as a diagnosis that the tiredness had a name, and then as a year that I don't have adequate words for. Alina Vega had run that ranch for 30 years with the same unfussy competence that she brought to everything, and watching her navigate a body that was turning against her with that same unfussy competence was one of the harder things I've witnessed. Marisol was 26 when Alina was diagnosed. She was 27 when her mother died. I was there for both. Daniel came to the funeral. He drove 4 hours from Taos, where he'd relocated for a new project, and he arrived before the service and left after everyone else had gone. I saw him from across the yard, talking to Margaret in the low afternoon light. He was wearing the same dark jacket he'd had at 25. I recognized it specifically because of a small burn mark near the left cuff that I'd noticed when he was working the Acequia survey. He looked like a man who was carrying something heavy and had decided to carry it quietly. Marisol found him before he left. I watched them from the porch, not close enough to hear, close enough to see. She said something. He said something. She looked at him for a long moment, that level, serious look she had, the one that meant she was processing something, and then she nodded once, and he nodded once, and they stood that way for a breath or two longer than the conversation required. Then he left. I went inside and wrote. She looked at him tonight like she was trying to remember something she'd forgotten she'd learned. I don't know what that means. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it means everything. The ranch survived Alina's death because Marisol made it survive. That is the simple and complete version of what happened. Marisol was 27 years old, grieving, exhausted, managing a water dispute that had not yet resolved, handling the financial tangles of an estate that needed careful attention, and she simply did it. Not without struggle, not without visible cost, but with the same particular stubbornness that ran through the Vega women like a structural element, like the load-bearing wall you don't notice until you realize the whole house would fall without it. I stayed. I hadn't planned to. I'd been thinking about moving on, the way I thought about moving on every few years. But I stayed because I was needed, and because leaving felt like abandonment, and I have my flaws, but that isn't one of them. For 2 years it was just work, good, grinding, necessary work. The ranch found its footing. The water dispute settled, not perfectly, but sufficiently. Marisol hired a second full-time hand and a seasonal worker, and the operation became, by any reasonable measure, stable. She was 29 when Daniel Harrow came back. He didn't call ahead. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late September, drove into the yard, and parked his truck by the barn. I was repairing a section of fence near the gate, and I saw him get out and look around the way a person looks around a place they've thought about often, and are now reconciling with the actual physical reality of. He saw me, he nodded. I nodded back. He walked toward the house, knocked on the door, and waited. Marisol opened it, and I heard her say, even at that distance, the air was still enough, Daniel. Just his name, one syllable of contained surprise. I went back to the fence. I kept my head down. But I was counting nails and screws and my mind was elsewhere, and I wrote that night in the logbook for the first time in a while. He's back again. Something is different this time. I don't know what. Something in the way he stood at the door, like a man who has made a decision. I didn't know then what the decision was. I would find out. He stayed for dinner. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, he had offered, casually, practically, to help assess a section of the eastern pasture that Marisol had mentioned needed drainage work. He had the expertise. She had the problem. It was natural. Or it appeared natural. I had spent enough time watching Daniel Harrow to know that his naturalness was often more deliberate than it looked. Over the following weeks, something shifted. It shifted in the incremental way that real things shift, not dramatically, not with clarity, but in small accumulations. He stopped leaving at sunset and started staying until dark. He brought coffee from the small place in town that Marisol liked, and he brought it without asking if she wanted it because he'd learned, somewhere along the years, that she always wanted it. He fixed things on the property without being asked, not in the way that assumes ownership, but in the way that says I notice what needs doing and I'm here. Marisol accepted all of it. She was cautious in the way she was cautious with everything now, since Alina, since Patrick, since the years of carrying things alone. But she accepted it. And I watched and I wrote and I thought, something is going to happen. Whatever he came back to say, he's getting ready to say it. What I could not have predicted, what nobody could have predicted, was what was going to happen first. It was Margaret who set it off, unintentionally, the way Margaret set most things off, with benign obliviousness and the particular conversational recklessness of someone who doesn't know which topics are dangerous. She came to visit in early October, to see Marisol and to have coffee, and to generally distribute herself across the afternoon with the cheerful energy she'd always had. I was nearby, sorting equipment in the barn, half in earshot. I heard Margaret's voice, bright and carrying. I always thought it was funny, you know, that Patrick would mention what Daniel said to him. Back then in Santa Fe. You know, before that whole business fell apart. A pause. Then Marisol's voice, quieter, careful. What did Daniel say to Patrick? Another pause, longer. Oh, you didn't know. Margaret said, and even across the yard I could hear the dawning comprehension that she had stepped on something. Well, I'm sure it doesn't matter now, it was ages ago. Daniel had gone to see Patrick. This was just before you went to Santa Fe yourself, I think, and he told him something about how Patrick should be honest with you about whether he was serious. Something like that. Patrick told me years later when he was feeling guilty about that whole period. I thought you knew, sweetheart, I'm sorry. I stopped sorting equipment. The yard was quiet. I waited. After a long moment, Marisol's voice came again. And it was a voice I hadn't heard from her before, very controlled, very flat. The way a voice gets when the person using it is working very hard to keep it that way. He knew, she said. He went to see Patrick, and he didn't tell me. I'm sure he had his reasons, Margaret said, flustered now. I'm sure he did, Marisol said. And then I heard the screen door open and close, and that was the end of the conversation. I saw her face that evening. I was putting the horses up for the night, and she came through the barn on her way back from the eastern pasture, and she stopped and stood for a moment with her hand on Segundo's stall. Old Segundo was retired now, 22 years old and mostly interested in sleeping, but she still visited him every evening as a matter of habit. Her face was doing something complicated. I've watched Marisol Vega's face through grief and exhaustion and anger and joy, and I've learned to read it the way you learn to read weather, not perfectly, not always accurately, but with some sense of what's coming. What I saw that evening was something I'd never quite seen on her before. It was the particular expression of a person rearranging a long-held belief, not changing her mind easily or quickly, but restructuring something, taking a thing she thought she understood and finding that it didn't fit the way she'd thought, and having to consider where it actually goes. I didn't say anything, it wasn't my place. But I wrote that night, she found out about Patrick and Daniel. Whatever she thought she knew about him, she's revising it now. I don't know in which direction. I don't know if he knows she knows. I don't know what happens next. For the first time in years, I genuinely don't know. And I put the logbook down and looked at the ceiling for a while. Outside, the wind was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the night smelled like sage and coming cold. And somewhere in the house Marisol Vega was sitting with a piece of information that had just changed the shape of 17 years. I thought about Daniel's truck in the driveway every morning for 3 weeks. The coffee, the fence work, the careful deliberateness of it all. I thought about a boy at a fence, trying to memorize something, not knowing if he'd get another chance. How long has that been there, I thought. And I closed the logbook. And I waited for morning. There is a cost to silence that most people don't calculate correctly. They think it's zero. They think not saying something means nothing changes, that the unsaid words just dissolve, harmless, into air. They think silence is neutral ground. It isn't. Silence is a choice. And like every choice, it reshapes the world around it, slowly, the way water reshapes stone, invisibly, consistently, until the day you look at something you thought you knew and realize it's been carved into a completely different shape. I know this because I watched it happen between two people over 17 years. And I know this because I kept the logbook. I picked it up the morning after Margaret's visit and wrote, 3 weeks of deliberate presence. 3 weeks of coffee and fence posts and careful proximity. He was building towards something. And now she knows a thing he never told her, and it's going to change the geometry of everything. The question is whether it changes toward or away. The answer was both, simultaneously, in the complicated way that real things happen. Daniel arrived at 9 that morning. His truck pulled into the yard with the same familiar pattern it had established over the 3 weeks. Engine off, brief pause before he got out. The unhurried way he moved across the yard toward the house like a man who had thought about his approach and decided on his pace. He knocked. Marisol opened the door. I was at the water trough, 20 yards away, and I could not hear the words from there. But I could see her face, and I could see his, and what I saw told me she wasn't going to do what I would have done. She wasn't going to confront him immediately. Not in the doorway, not with the emotional rawness of the previous evening still sitting close to the surface. Marisol was not an impulsive woman. She had been once, at 22, in the direction of Patrick Harrow, and she had paid for it in the specific currency of humiliation and grief. She had, since then, developed the habit of letting herself feel things completely before she acted on them. She let him in. She made coffee. She asked him practical questions about the drainage assessment he'd been working on. She listened to his answers. She was, and this is what impressed and alarmed me simultaneously, almost entirely normal. The only tell, if you knew her face as well as I did after 9 years, was a slight deliberateness in how she held her expression. She was working for neutral, and she was mostly achieving it, which meant she was working very hard. Daniel, to his credit, sensed it. Not immediately. He wasn't a man who read moods quickly. He was more the type who noticed things at the margin and sat with them before arriving at a conclusion. But around mid-morning, when he came back to the barn to collect a tool and found me there, he paused. He looked at me for a moment. I kept my face uncommunicative. I'm practiced at it. She's different today, he said, not a question. People are different on different days, I said. He looked at me for another moment. I could see him sitting with it, considering the shape of the change, trying to locate its origin. He didn't ask me what I knew. That was Daniel. He didn't press for information. He waited to be given it or not given it and proceeded accordingly. He went back to the eastern pasture. I wrote in the logbook that afternoon, he knows something's shifted. He doesn't know what. She knows something she didn't know. He doesn't know she knows. This is going to be one of those slow collisions. The kind that feel inevitable afterward and terrifying during. Marisol didn't bring it up for 4 days. 4 days of normal. Of coffee and drainage work and dinner at the table where Alina used to sit. Of ordinary conversation, and the kind of comfortable silences that accumulate between people who have known each other long enough that quiet doesn't have to be filled. I watched her in those 4 days and I watched her think. That's the only way I can describe it. I watched the thinking happen behind her face, patient and systematic. She was solving something. Not just the equation of Daniel and what Margaret had said, but something larger, some long-standing accounting of her own that she'd been putting off. On the 4th evening, Daniel was helping replace a section of fence near the south corner of the property when Marisol walked out to him at dusk, alone, carrying 2 bottles of water. I was in the field adjacent, too far to hear, close enough to see. She handed him the water. He took it. They stood side by side at the fence for a moment, looking out at the desert going pink and purple in the dying light. Then she said something. He went very still in that particular way he had, the stillness of a person who is not ceasing to move, but rather collecting themselves completely. He said something in response. She said something else. Her posture, which had been easy, went careful. He said something. She turned her head to look at him directly. They were talking about it. I knew it from 30 yards away. I couldn't have said exactly what they were saying, but the conversation had the particular quality of a conversation that's been necessary for a long time, and is finally happening. Slightly awkward, slightly too deliberate, the kind of talking that people do when they're scared of where the words are going. Then Marisol made a gesture I'd seen her make before, a small, dismissive movement with her right hand, the kind she made when she was ending a conversation she didn't know how to finish. She turned back to the fence. Daniel looked at the side of her face for a moment, and I could see, even at that distance, the same careful restraint he'd always had, the deep breath of a man holding something that's trying to get out. He didn't push. She said something quiet that I couldn't hear. He nodded. She walked back toward the house. He stood at the fence for several minutes after she left, looking out at the desert, in the way a man looks at something when he's not actually seeing it. I went back to the barn without approaching him. Some moments are private, even when you've witnessed them. That night I wrote, they talked about it, I don't know what was said, but I know the way a conversation looks when it has only moved something without resolving it. They moved something. Neither of them is lighter for it. Maybe that's not how it works. Maybe moving something heavy doesn't make you lighter right away. Maybe it just makes you tired in a different place. What I pieced together later, from Marisol herself, who told me things over the years that she didn't always realize she was telling me, was approximately this. She had asked him why he'd gone to see Patrick, plain and direct, because that was how she asked things. He had told her the truth, because he'd known Patrick was already moving on and thought she deserved to know. She had asked why he hadn't told her. He had paused for a long time. Then he had said something like, "Because I wasn't sure you'd want to hear it from me. And because I thought if I told you, you'd wonder why I was telling you and I wasn't ready to answer that." She had understood from that there was something he hadn't been saying. She had also understood, and this was what made her retreat, made her use the dismissive hand gesture and end the conversation, that she wasn't sure what to do with that information. Wasn't sure what it meant for her. Wasn't sure she wanted to find out when she was still, in some irreducible part of herself, angry. Not at Daniel exactly, but angry at the 17 years she felt she'd been moving through slightly off-angle, slightly misaligned with something without knowing what. She was angry at the silence, at all the things that hadn't been said when they might have changed something. And the complicated, difficult truth, the one she was working out across 4 days of careful thinking, was that she didn't know if saying them earlier would have changed anything at all, and she didn't know how to be angry at a silence without knowing what it cost. Daniel came back the next morning. He came back the morning after that. He kept coming back with the same deliberateness, the same practical purpose. There was always something legitimate to do. The ranch always needed the work. The drainage assessment was ongoing. But we both knew, he and I, that the work was not the point. He was giving her time. That was what he was doing. He had said something, partially in the coded way they both spoke, the way people who are afraid of being explicit about important things speak. And now he was giving her room to decide what to do with it. I respected it. I also found it, if I'm honest, slightly maddening. I am not a patient man by nature. I keep the logbook because writing things down is the closest I get to patience, the act of putting a moment in a box and leaving it there until you understand it. But Daniel Harrow made patience look like something other than waiting. It looked like presence, like showing up in the absence of certainty, like deciding that the world you want to be in is worth inhabiting even before you know for sure you're allowed to stay. 3 more weeks. He came back every morning. He worked. He stayed for meals when invited. He didn't push. And Marisol, I watched her carefully, slowly, day by day, let some of the carefulness in herself ease. Not dramatically. She didn't have dramatic easings. She wasn't built for them. But incrementally, the way things change when they're changing truly rather than performed. She started arriving at the fence when he was working there, not to check on the work, but to be near it. She started asking questions that weren't practical. Not where does the pipe need to go, but what do you think about this? What do you see when you look at this land? She was letting herself be curious about him, the adult version, the man he'd become, the person who had carried the thing he'd carried and still built a life around it. And Daniel answered her questions with the particular care of someone who has been waiting a long time to be asked. It happened on a Tuesday, mid-afternoon. I know because I dated every entry. I was in the barn when I heard the screen door open and close. I didn't look up immediately. Screen doors open and close on ranches approximately every 20 minutes, and there is nothing notable about the sound. But then I didn't hear footsteps in the yard, and the silence had a certain quality, and I looked up. Marisol was standing on the porch. She had a piece of paper in her hand. I would later understand this was a letter, handwritten, that Daniel had left on the kitchen table without announcement. She was reading it. Her face was very still. I didn't go out. Whatever was on that paper was between them and had nothing to do with me. But I stayed where I was, quietly, because I have the particular failing of a man who watches things, and I couldn't make myself look away. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she stood with it and looked out at the eastern pasture where I could see Daniel's truck parked along the fence line, which meant he was still out there, working, and hadn't yet driven away. She went back inside. I breathed. Approximately 15 minutes later, she came out of the house, walked across the yard, and went through the gate toward the eastern pasture. I took out the logbook. I wrote she went to him after reading whatever he left. She went to him. I don't know what was in the letter and I won't ask, but she went. Voluntarily, without being called. Then I put the logbook away and got back to work. What Daniel had written in the letter I know because Marisol told me eventually. Not immediately, not for months. But she told me one evening when we were having coffee on the porch after a long day, the way people tell things when they've decided the person across from them has earned the information. She said it wasn't long. 4 paragraphs, she said. He wasn't a man for long letters. The first paragraph was practical. The drainage assessment was essentially complete. He didn't need to keep coming back on that basis. The second paragraph said, "I've been coming back because I wanted to. I want you to know that the work was real, and the reason was also real, and I'm not apologizing for either of them." The third paragraph said something that Marisol told me in a slightly lower voice, looking at her coffee cup. "I went to see Patrick because I didn't want to watch you walk into something that was going to hurt you. I didn't tell you because I didn't trust myself to tell you without saying the rest of it, and the rest of it wasn't mine to say yet. I'm still not sure it is, but I'm increasingly sure that not saying it has cost more than saying it would have." The fourth paragraph said, "I've been in love with you since I was 18 years old. I understand completely if that information does nothing useful for either of us. But I've been carrying it for 11 years, and it seems wasteful at this point not to at least put it somewhere it can breathe." Marisol stopped there. I waited. 4 paragraphs, she said again, like that was the remarkable thing. 11 years, 4 paragraphs. I said, "What did you say to him when you went out to the pasture?" She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "I asked him if that was supposed to be a proposal," she said. "He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he wasn't expecting. And I said, because I was still angry, I was still half angry, I said, this feels like revenge. For Patrick, for all of it. You waited until I was down, and now you're telling me this." She stopped. "He didn't say anything for a long time," she said. "He just looked at me. And then he said, the only way I could be using this as revenge is if it weren't true. And it's true. It's the truest thing I know." She was quiet. I didn't ask what happened after that. She told me anyway. "I didn't know what to say," she said, "so I didn't say anything. And he waited. He's always been very good at waiting. And eventually I said, I don't know what to do with that, and he said, you don't have to do anything with it today." She looked up from her coffee cup. "Then he finished the fence section and packed his tools and drove away," she said. "Just like that. No scene. No pressure. He said he'd call, and he did 3 days later, and we talked for an hour about something completely unrelated, and then at the end he asked if he could come for dinner the following Saturday. And I said yes." She set down the coffee cup. "It wasn't revenge," she said quietly. "That's what I kept thinking about in those 3 days. I kept waiting to find the angle, the way it was strategic, the way he was using it. I've been lied to enough that I know how to look for the mechanism, but there wasn't one. It was just what he said, the truest thing he knew, 11 years. She shook her head slowly, not in negation, but in something that looked like wonder that has gone a little tired at its edges. 11 years, she said, and he was waiting for it to be the right time, and I was waiting for someone to just say something real, and we were both waiting on opposite sides of a wall that could have come down at any point if one of us had just walked up to it. What I wrote in the logbook that evening was long, longer than usual. I filled 4 pages. At the end, I wrote, I've been keeping this record for 9 years. I've written down fences and droughts and horses and wages and the way Alina laughed at her own jokes. I've written down 2 people who didn't say the things they should have said for years, for reasons that were real and understandable and cost them anyway. I don't think Daniel was wrong to wait. I don't think Marisol was wrong to guard herself. I think they were both doing the best they could with what they had, and the best they could for a long time wasn't quite enough. But they're still here, both of them. That seems important. The wall came down. Not dramatically. Nothing between these 2 people ever happens dramatically. Just a letter on a kitchen table, and a woman walking out to a fence in the late afternoon. I wonder if that's how it usually happens. Not the grand moment, but the ordinary one. Not the event, but the accumulation. I wonder if I should tell Daniel about the logbook sometime. The entry from when he was 18 at the fence. The one where I wrote something in his face I can't name. I think he'd want to know I'd named it eventually. I'll decide another day. There is one more thing from that period that I've never written down before. Not in the logbook, not anywhere. It happened the Saturday Daniel came to dinner. I was invited too. Alina's table had always accommodated the whole operation, and that tradition had continued. And we sat, the 3 of us, in the kitchen with its scarred wooden table and the particular smell of old wood and chili and good coffee. And we ate and talked and didn't talk about any of the large things. At one point, Daniel got up to refill the water glasses, just an ordinary gesture. And as he passed behind Marisol's chair, he put his hand, briefly, just for a moment, barely a contact at all, on her shoulder. Marisol didn't look up. She kept eating. But her shoulders, which had been slightly raised in the way they'd been raised for most of the last year, since everything came down, just slightly, just enough. I noticed. I always notice. I didn't write it down that night. Some things are too private for logbooks. But I'm writing it now because it matters. Because the large things in a person's life are rarely the large events. They're the small ones, the hand on the shoulders that come down, the moment when a person who has been carrying something alone realizes, quietly, without announcement, that they don't have to anymore. I looked away. Outside the window, the night was clear and cold, and the stars over the high desert were extravagant and indifferent, and the world was both exactly what it had always been and quietly, fundamentally changed. Some silences cost you things, and some silences, the ones that finally end, give them back. There is something peculiar about witnessing the end of a long thing. You'd think it would feel like completion, like a circle closed, but the truth is it feels more like the moment after a storm, not peaceful exactly, just different in texture. Quieter. The air changed. Everything still wet and rearranged, and the world going about its ordinary business with no acknowledgement of what just moved through it. I've thought about this often, about how the largest things in our lives don't announce themselves as large. The morning you wake up and your mother is dying. The afternoon you walk out to a fence and say something true for the first time in 11 years. The Tuesday you read 4 paragraphs on a kitchen table and the ground beneath you shifts, not violently, but permanently. We want fanfare. We want to know when the important thing is happening. We almost never do. The logbook for that winter is thicker than the others. I'm not sure why the days weren't especially eventful. The ranch moved through its rhythms. The drainage improvements held. December came cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the stars look closer, and I spent most of it working through the routine maintenance that accumulates like slow interest over a long season. But I wrote more. I think it was because I knew, instinctively, that I was in the part of the story that needed to be kept carefully. The part that comes after the dramatic reversal and before the settled thing. The transitional months when two people are figuring out what they've agreed to, and who they are to each other now, and whether the ground is as solid as it felt in the moment. That ground can fail. I've seen it. The cleared air doesn't always stay clear. People go back to old habits, old defenses, old positions. The wall that comes down can be rebuilt in smaller configurations that are harder to see. I watched for that. I don't think I was wrong to watch. Daniel came for Christmas. This was not, as far as I understood, a planned or announced thing. He called Marisol a few days beforehand and asked if there was room at the table, and she said yes, and he drove up Christmas Eve with a bag of provisions and stayed through the 26th. I had Christmas dinner with them, again, the tradition, and I watched two people being careful with each other in a way that was slightly different from the earlier carefulness. Less guarded, more deliberate in a gentler sense, like people deciding, actively and repeatedly, to be kind. They talked about Daniel's work. He was consulting on a larger acequia restoration project across 3 counties, a 3-year initiative that would require a base of operations somewhere in the northern part of the state. He didn't say here, but the word sat in the room after he described the geography. Marisol asked questions about the project. Good ones. She'd been involved in water issues with the ranch long enough to have genuine expertise, and Daniel answered as though her questions were exactly the right ones, which they were. After dinner, she stepped out to do the last check on the horses, her evening ritual, inherited from Alina, and Daniel helped me with the dishes in the kitchen without being asked. We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then he said, "You've been watching all of this, haven't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I'm a watchful person," I said. "I know," he said, "you always have been." A pause. "She told me once years ago that you kept a logbook about the ranch." "I do." He looked at the dish in his hands for a moment. "Did you write about us?" I considered my options. Daniel was not a man to whom you lied and expected it to hold. "Some," I said. "What did you figure out?" "That you were in love with her from the beginning," I said. "That she didn't know. That you didn't say it for a long time. That there were reasons for that, and the reasons made sense, and they cost you anyway." He put the dish in the rack. I should have said it sooner, he said. Probably, I said, but you said it eventually. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, was she ever going to get there on her own, without me saying anything? I don't know, I said. I think she knew something was there. I think she was afraid of being wrong about it. You have that in common. He nodded, not surprised. The fence, he said suddenly. What? The first time I came to the ranch. I was 18. I stood at the corral fence and watched her work that horse. Segundo, I said. He looked at me. You remember that? I was timing the horse, I said. You stood there for 4 minutes. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 4 minutes. I stood there and I thought, I've never seen anyone pay that kind of attention to anything. Not aggressive attention, not showy, just accurate. She was seeing the horse the way it actually was, and I thought if someone like that ever looked at me that way, I'd want to know what they saw. He picked up another dish. 30 years old, he said, more to himself than to me, and I'm finally finding out. The proposal happened in February. I say the proposal because that's what it became eventually, though it didn't start that way. It started as a conversation about the base of operations for Daniel's project, a practical matter, location, and logistics. He was going to need somewhere to set up for 3 years. He was considering a rental in Taos or possibly in Raton. He and Marisol were at the kitchen table. I was in the barn, but the kitchen window was open despite the February cold because Marisol always ran warm and kept the kitchen too hot for most human beings, and the air carried. I wasn't eavesdropping, I was nearby. The practical conversation happened first. The logistics, the project requirements, the general geography. And then there was a pause that had a different quality from the previous pauses, and Daniel said, I want to stay here. Silence. Here, he said, the ranch, with you. Or near you, whatever. I could rent the Salazar place at the corner if you. Daniel, Marisol said, I know this is fast. It's been 17 years. That's not, he stopped. I mean, it's been complicated. It's not like we were. It's been 17 years, she said again in a different tone. Not accusatory, something else. You showed up at my fence when I was 17 years old, and you've been in and out of my life ever since. And 6 months ago, you wrote me a letter that said you'd been carrying this for 11 years, and now you're asking to stay. That's what you're asking. Right. A pause. Yes, he said. That's what I'm asking. And I'm supposed to just. You're not supposed to do anything, he said. I'm asking, that's all, just asking. Another silence, longer. I stopped what I was doing in the barn. I did not move. Why didn't you ask 11 years ago, Marisol said. And it wasn't an accusation. I could hear it from where I was, the absence of accusation in it. It was a real question. She was genuinely asking. Daniel's answer came slowly. Because 11 years ago I didn't know if what I felt was the right thing or just the most comfortable one. He stopped. You know what it's like to grow up not being sure which version of yourself is the real one, the one people expect or the one you actually are? I'd spent years figuring that out. I needed to know I was choosing you because I saw you clearly and wanted you specifically, not because you were the first person who ever made me feel like I was simply myself. Those aren't the same thing. I needed to know the difference. Silence. And you know the difference now, Marisol said. I know you're stubborn and you get angry quietly, which is actually scarier than getting angry loudly, and you think you're less afraid than you are, and you are still the most accurate person I've ever met. You see things the way they actually are, not the way they're supposed to be. And his voice stopped for a moment. I am in love with the person I know now, not just the person I met at a fence. A very long silence. What if I say yes, and it doesn't work, Marisol said. Then we'll know, he said, and we'll have lost whatever time it takes to find out, which is better than the alternative. What's the alternative? 11 more years of me renting the Salazar place. I heard something that might have been a laugh from Marisol, short, surprised out of her. That's not funny, she said, and she sounded like she thought it was slightly funny. I'm not trying to be funny, Daniel said. I'm just saying I'm 30 years old and I'm not interested in more metaphorical fence posts. I want to be on the same side of the fence, if you want that too. Silence. I thought, say something, say the thing, don't make him wait anymore. She didn't make him wait anymore. Yes, she said, I want that too. And then nothing for a while, The good kind of nothing. The nothing that isn't empty. I wrote in the logbook that night. It happened today. No fanfare. A kitchen table in February with the window open and cold air coming in. He asked to stay. She said yes, that's it. 17 years of circling something, and that's how it ends, a practical conversation that became an honest one. I've been keeping this record for 12 years, and I am not ashamed to say my handwriting got a little unsteady on that last entry. Alina would have loved this. She would have said something dry and affectionate, and then made more coffee. I miss her. I think Daniel and Marisol miss her together in a specific way that's different from each of them missing her separately. There's something in how they talk about her that's already collective. I think they're going to be all right. I think that because I've watched both of them for a long time, and they are, each of them, the kind of person who does things for real or not at all. When they commit to something, they see it through. They've both committed to more difficult things than each other. That said, I reserve the right to keep the logbook going. Old habits. Spring came the way spring comes to the high desert. Not warmly, but certainly. The cold releasing its grip one reluctant degree at a time, until suddenly one morning you're in shirt sleeves and don't remember deciding to change. Daniel moved into the Salazar place at the property's corner. He had, after all, rented it, which struck me as simultaneously practical and funny. The base of operations for his project, legitimately so. He set up his surveying equipment and his maps in the spare bedroom and drove to Marisol's kitchen every morning for coffee. He had always brought the coffee. Now he just didn't need a reason. The ranch had a different quality that spring. I noticed it the way I notice most things, at the margins in the texture. Small things. The screen door staying open in the evenings because two people were on the porch rather than one. The way the horses had adjusted their expectation of who might come through the barn door. The way the kitchen, which had been a little too quiet since Alina, had recovered its previous sound level, which was not loud but was not empty. Marisol was different too, and she would probably object to me saying so, because she dislikes the idea that other people can read her. But she was. Slightly looser in some internal configuration I couldn't name precisely. Still herself, still stubborn and accurate and prone to an anger that came in silence and a joy that came in the small, unplanned moments rather than the large, anticipated ones. But like a person who has set down something they were carrying and feels, not relief exactly, but a different kind of weight. The weight of choosing, of being chosen, of deciding that a thing is worth the risk of it. The formal proposal, the down on one knee, the ring happened in late April. I wasn't there for it. Deliberately, I think. Daniel is not a man who stages things for an audience. What I know, Marisol told me the next morning over coffee, in the flat, unadorned way she tells important things. She said, "Daniel asked me to marry him last night." She set down her cup. She looked at me with an expression I'd never quite seen on her before, something unguarded and slightly overwhelmed, and underneath it all, quietly luminous. I said yes. "I know," I said. She looked at me. "You know, did he tell you?" "No," I said, "I just know." She shook her head, something between exasperation and fondness in her face, which was a combination I'd been seeing more of lately. "You and that logbook." "It's not in the logbook," I said. "I just know." She picked up her coffee again. She looked out the window at the yard, at the morning light on the red dirt and the blue sky and the far mountains. "He told me," she said quietly, "that he'd thought about asking me for years, that every time he came close to it he'd tell himself he wasn't ready. And then finally he realized the thing he was waiting for wasn't readiness. He was already ready. He was waiting for me to be ready." She was quiet for a moment. "And I thought, is that how it looks, from outside? Was it that obvious that I wasn't ready?" "You were afraid," I said. "I was afraid he was doing it for the wrong reasons," she said. "That it was about Patrick, or about some old wound I didn't know about, or about the land, or about needing something. I kept looking for the mechanism. The angle." She shook her head. "There wasn't one. There was just a man who had been paying attention to me for 17 years and finally said so." She looked at me. "How do you carry something like that for 17 years without it going bitter?" she said, "without it becoming resentment?" I thought about it. "He built a life around it instead of against it," I said. "It was part of him, not instead of him. That's different." She nodded slowly. "I didn't know that was possible," she said. "I think most people don't," I said. "There's something I want to say about this, about what I observed across those months. And I want to say it plainly because I think it tends to get obscured in accounts of love stories, which tend to reach for the large and the cinematic and the clearly meaning-laden. What I observed mostly was ordinary. Two people figuring out how to share space, the small negotiations of whose preferences take precedence when, whose silences are about what, how to be in the same room without losing the version of yourself that got you to the room in the first place. Daniel and Marisol were not seamless. They had friction, real friction, not the decorative kind. They disagreed about the ranch finances in ways that required several tense conversations before finding a framework. They navigated carefully the complicated relationship between Daniel's heritage and the land they were both on, the history of it, the weight of who had been here and who had come, and what it meant to claim a piece of ground. Those conversations were not easy, and several of them did not end resolved. Marisol's stubborn certainty, which was her great strength, was also, in those months, occasionally the thing that needed to give ground. She was learning that. It wasn't always comfortable. Daniel's discipline, his habit of holding things inside until he'd fully understood them, was occasionally the thing that frustrated her most. She had waited long enough, she felt, for him to say what he was thinking. The learning curve of believing that his silences were processing rather than withdrawal was real and ongoing. But they kept going. That was the thing I kept writing down in the logbook. Not the romantic moments, not the easy afternoons, but the moments when something was hard and they did it anyway. The moments when one of them was wrong and said so. The moments when the conversation needed to be had at 10 o'clock at night after a long day, and they had it anyway. Those moments, in my experience, are what a real thing is made of. The wedding, they called it a small ceremony, which it was, by the standards of the region, happened in September, under the cottonwoods along the creek. The trees had gone gold because the high desert does its most significant things in October, but it gives you a preview in September, the light going amber and the air going dry and sweet. I was there, of course I was there. Margaret was there, slightly emotional and slightly oblivious to why she was emotional, which was her way. Daniel's father was not there. That absence had its own weight that Daniel carried with characteristic quietness. Some of the Acequia project team attended. A few of Marisol's friends from Albuquerque. Elena's sister from Chihuahua, who had driven 11 hours and said almost nothing all weekend, but watched everything with the same intelligent attention that Elena had had, which made Marisol cry briefly on the morning of the ceremony and recover completely in about 4 minutes. The ceremony itself was short. Neither of them were given to elaboration. What I wrote down about it afterward was not the vows, because those belonged to them. What I wrote down was this: Daniel looked at Marisol the way he looked at her at the fence when he was 18. The same look, trying to memorize something, except this time he's allowed to keep looking. He knows that now. And Marisol, after the rings were exchanged, put her hand against his chest, a small gesture, not theatrical, just checking. Like she needed to confirm through the material reality of his sternum that this was happening. He put his hand over hers. That was it. That was the whole thing. And then I closed the logbook for a while. Not because I was done, I'm never done, but because some things deserve a pause, a breath taken between chapters, a moment when you stop observing and just exist in the place the observation has led you. There's a last thing. Months later, the following spring, I was going through the old logbooks to find a specific entry about the Acequia that Daniel needed for the project documentation. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the stack of spiral notebooks, the whole 12 years of them, and Marisol came in and saw what I was doing and asked what I was looking for. I told her. She sat down across from me and started leafing through one of the early ones, the first year I was on the ranch, when she was 11, and I watched her face moving through expressions as she recognized references to things she'd forgotten. She stopped at a page. Read. You wrote about Daniel, she said, not quite a question. Many times, I said. She looked at the page. You wrote about him at the fence. 1st October I was here, I said. She looked up at me, something moving in her expression. What does it say? I recited it from memory because I'd read it enough times to have it. Daniel Harrow at the fence today. Something in his face I can't name. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the page. She touched the edge of it the way she'd touched Segundo's stall, habit and tenderness mixed. Did you ever name it? She asked. Eventually, I said. What was it? I thought about how to say it simply enough to be true. He was trying to memorize you, I said, in case he didn't get another chance to look. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear Daniel's boots on the porch. He'd been out checking the fence line, which still, even now, needed regular attention. The screen door opened. He came in, smelling of cold air and dry grass, and he looked at us both at the table and saw the notebooks and looked at Marisol's face. "What's happening?" he said. Marisol looked at him, that level, accurate look she had, seeing him the way things actually are. 17 years, she said. Did you know he was tracking you? Daniel looked at me. I said nothing, I have a policy. He looked back at Marisol, something quiet happening in his expression. Logbook, he said. Logbook, she confirmed. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Tell me, he said. And she did. She read him the entries that mentioned him, not all of them, just the significant ones. The fence, the summer with Patrick, the funeral. The fence line at dusk where he'd tried to say something and couldn't, and I'd watched from 30 yards away and written down that it looked like a slow-motion disaster. He listened, he didn't interrupt. This was Daniel. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. You saw it, he said to me, from the beginning. Yes, I said. He looked at Marisol. Did you, he asked. She held his gaze. She took a breath that was slightly longer than necessary. I think I knew something was there, she said. I didn't know what to do with it. I wasn't sure I could trust what I was seeing. But you see it now, he said. Yes, she said, I see it now. He reached across the table, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, and covered her hand with his. The same gesture as that first dinner. Simple, material. True. I closed the notebook. Outside, the high desert was doing what the high desert does in spring, recovering quietly at its own pace, in the colors of rust and gold and green that you only notice if you're paying the right kind of attention. The acequia was running. The horses were moving in the east pasture. The mountains to the north still had snow at the high elevations, white against the blue morning sky.